So let's look at how to add a label onto a transparent object. Here I've got a sort of a glass cylinder, and we'll look at doing it in a couple of different ways. So what we're trying to achieve is to keep the transparency but have the diffuse channel able to show local color on top of the transparency. So you can see if we jump into Photoshop here, I've got a texture that I've made. It's probably advisable actually to make this a square shape, like 1024 by 1024. Mine is not, but Maya tends to work better when you have square textures. I also actually saved this out with a black background, and we'll talk about why later on. But anyway, it's got this as the color channel. It's going to have a black background, and then it has an alpha channel too that, let me just turn this off, just looks like this. So it's blocking out the back, so this is transparent and this is opaque where it's white. And we're going to use this information to cut out the color in Maya. Okay, so you got to make something like that. And just a word of warning, you probably want to rasterize your layers if you've made this out of shapes in Photoshop or using the text tool, just so it's no longer editable. It's just pixels in a bitmap. Okay, so let's hop back into here and we'll hide this one. So we'll just start with a standard cylinder, and I'll turn off my rendering for now. The reason we're starting with a standard cylinder is just because I want to show you how the UV maps work. Now I think this one I did already. I had a bit of a crash before. Let's see. Oh yeah, so let me create a new one actually. So I'll just create a polygon cylinder. I'm going to scale it up, and you can see the UV texture editor there to the right. And this shows how the UVs are laid out. So how this 3D surface is cut up into pieces and laid out into a 2D space. And it's all laid out within this square here. It's kind of hard to tell this thicker line, but this is called the 0 to 1 UV space. And so this is the UV shell that defines the 2D coordinates of the part that wraps around here. So it's a 3D object, so the barrel, the surface that wraps around the barrel, and there's a 2D representation of it in 2D on a 2D plane. And so if we make a texture, it's going to be stretched to fit within the 0 to 1 UV space. And you can see that the barrel is only occupying a small portion of this. So let's say we made a texture that was 1024 by 1024. This whole barrel is just occupying a really small portion of this. It looks like maybe 1/8 of it, or even less. So we can do stuff like grab a UV. So I'm just going to grab one on the corner here. Hold down Command, right click, and say to UV shell. So UV shell is a discrete piece of UVs, and we can manipulate these individually and independently. So I can do something like this just to give it more space. Now I could grab these, since I'm not going to be texturing the caps, I could grab these caps and scale them down, move them out of the way, whatever, just to give more space to the part that I am texturing. But let's just leave it like this for now. Nothing has changed on here, as you can see. I'm not sure why this always shows up now as, it shows up, oh, there we go. It's just when the UV editor is open, it shows the UV shells on screen. So I'll assign a new material to this. I'm going to create a new Arnold surface, AI standard surface. So here it is in the hypershade. Everything's pretty small here, but I'm trying to fit it all on screen at once. So I'll select this new AI standard surface, and I'll just call this label glass. And so this is the material. This is the whole material that will include the glass qualities, but will also have the label plugged into it. So to do this, we're going to use a Maya 2D texture node called a file node. And another way of getting this is just hitting tab here in the hypershade. If you don't have your hypershade open, you can open it here by pressing this button up here, this sphere with kind of hole in the middle. And we can start typing for the node that we want. We want the file texture node. And you'll get two. One node that holds the file and defines certain properties about it. And then this node, it's called the place 2D texture node. And this defines how this file is positioned onto this object. And it defines how it's positioned by placing it in that 0 to 1 UV space. So anyway, let's just bring this file in. So I've got the file selected, and so I can search for the image name or browse for the image name, clicking on here. I've got it ready already, and mine's called medicine label. You'll see that in my browser here it says medicinelabel.tiff. That's what I made it as. I saved it as a TIFF for a reason, and the reason is that a TIFF can hold an alpha channel. Remember, in here we have the RGB stuff, the red, green, and blue, the color, and then in the channels we have an alpha channel, which defines the cutout, or what's transparent and what's not, right? So when you want to save that out, a JPEG cannot hold an alpha channel, so don't use a JPEG, and a JPEG is also compressed. Don't use a JPEG. Bad idea. Save it as a TIFF. There are even better ways to do it, but TIFF is fine. Because Arnold ultimately copies this and duplicates this file and saves it as a .tx, and that's their proprietary texture file format, and evidently it renders way faster. Anyway, I'll select my TIFF and it will convert it for me to a .tx file. Okay, so that is now in the file node. I'll try and zoom in here a little bit so it's easier to see. So here's the file node. You can see representation of the image. It's not attached to my material yet. This material has already been assigned to this object. So let's say this won't be how we do the glass. This is just to show how it appears on the surface. But on the file, we've got the out color and out alpha. Now, if there's an alpha channel in your file, then out alpha will use that alpha channel, and you can connect that to things. If there's no alpha channel, then out alpha will really just calculate the kind of luminosity of each pixel from black to white. Here we just, in this case, this again, not doing the glass label yet, we're just showing how it's positioned. So we'll take the out color of the file and just left click drag over to base color. Here. And so we can see that it's being placed on the surface. And if we look in the UV editor, and then we can see, now you can see how my label, you can't see the whole thing because I've got a black background here, is being spread into the whole 0 to 1 UV space. And you can see the bottom of the pill is right here, and that's right where it crosses over the UVs for the barrel part. So how can we change how this is positioned? Well, we could do stuff like, if we wanted to, we can select one UV, command right click to shell, and if I move the UVs, you can see that it changes how this is positioned. Now, it's usually bad practice to have UVs overlapping, so I wouldn't do it that way, at least in this case, because I don't want to have the top overlapping with the side. The other thing you can do is actually change how the file is placed here by going to the Place 2D Texture node. So I click on this and then go to the Attribute Editor. We can see certain things. So if I go to this Coverage node, so let's just look at the different things here. We've got coverage, so that's how much of the 0 to 1 UV space this thing is going to occupy. So right now it's occupying the whole thing. If I just drag this out so we can see both at once, change the coverage to 0.5, and this is 0.5. So now it's occupying 1/4, right? Kind of makes sense. Now remember, I didn't make it square, so it's kind of being stretched up. So I'm going to change the coverage to 0.35. Oops, wrong one. That's the U direction. I forgot I should be doing that in the V direction. That's the up and down direction. So let me change this to 0.35, see if that works. Okay, so that looks better. Now I want to position it up in the middle here, right? So we can kind of see it over here. So I can use translate frame. So this is the frame, right? So if I move it up to to the right 0.25, and then move it up so it's U and V in these two columns. Move it up 0.5, it's too high, 0.35, maybe 0.3. Anyway, kind of get it positioned. Now it's way too low. So actually I think it's too big anyway, so I'm going to reduce the size of it to this one to 0.35 and this one to 0.25. Yeah, let's do that. And then I have to change the coverage. Another way you can move this is if you hold down Command and middle mouse drag over the field with the value in it, then you can use it like a slider. Anyway, okay, so that's good position. That looks the way that I want it to look. So that's being positioned properly. We still can't see the medicine, but I'm going to cut that out later on. Okay, so now one thing we want to do is make this thing now transparent, right? So if I go into the attribute editor for the shader, I can turn up transmission and it becomes transparent, right? Another thing I have to do here is, now this is the way that Arnold works, is that in the shape node for this, I'm going to delete the history on this thing, in the shape node for this object, under Arnold here, Arnold Translator Polymesh, they're all by default defined as opaque. So every object that you create, Arnold will by default think it's opaque, even if you tell it to be transmissive in the shader that you apply to it. And it will work as a transmissive or transparent object, but the shadows won't work properly. So to make it work properly, you have to turn off opaque in the shape node of the object. Now we'll go back to the material. So we want to use the alpha channel of this thing that we made to tell it where to be transmissive or transparent and where it should not. So if we just pop back into Photoshop here, here's the alpha channel. So this says, you have to think of colors like values. So this is white and this is black. In Maya's language, white is 100% and black is 0. And so 50% gray would be halfway between those two. And so those values can be used to drive certain properties. And sometimes it will be reversed the way that you think it's going to be. But here in the file node, I can take the out alpha and hook it up to this attribute called transmission in my shader, in my material. And so that is this value here, transmission weight. So weight is just how much this is going to be applied. So I can just go from out alpha, I'll get in a little bit closer so you can see, just left mouse click, drag onto transmission. And let's see if this is working. Not really, it's kind of acting weird, right? So it might be that we actually have to reverse this alpha channel. Transmission, right, so if it's white, it's saying be fully transmissive, and if it's black, it's saying don't be transmissive. So we have to reverse that, because remember in Photoshop, we've got white here. We want this part to be black and this part to be white. So this is how you build a network. So we can just hit tab, and I know there's a node called a reverse node. I can spell it correctly. And then I can take the out alpha and plug it into the input. Now, what you'll see happen is, let me move these. So if I try and drag the out alpha onto the input, it grays out. That's because alpha is a single channel attribute. It's just got one value from black to white. Out color is a triple switch channel, a triple channel, because it's got RG and B in it. So we can hook up to other RGB or XYZ, anything that's triple it can hook up to. Out alpha is a single channel. So the input, if we open this up, it's got input X, Y, and Z. So I can take the out alpha and just hook it up to input X. So we're taking the alpha channel, going into a reverse node, so it's going to reverse it. And then we want to take the same output we went into X, we got to come out of X, and we'll go from output X to transmission. There you go, Bob's your uncle, right? So that seems to work pretty well. So just two things going on here. Now let's say, well, it's not perfectly transparent, right? It looks kind of funny right now. A couple things going on here. If we go into our label glass shader, the specular has some roughness. We turn that down, and we should get a nice clean transparency. Okay, I'm going to save this file because my fans just started spinning up. Now let's say we just wanted to do something that looked like a painted label with just one color. So what you could do in this case is still use the same file, but break the connection to the base color, right? So if I cut this connection, then we just still get the alpha cutout, right, in transmission. So saying this part is opaque, this part is transparent. Now we've got the diffuse still working, and I can just change the color of it. So let's say we want a white label, and we'll see a white label. My lighting is a little weird here, but oh yeah, it's lit this way. And so you can change this way, you can change the label to whatever color you want. Or again, if I want the color that I have in the texture that I brought in, I can just take out color of the texture, the file node, and go into base color, and it will apply that. So it's not that difficult to set this up. I've glossed over a few things like UVs and how those work, but I'll come back to that in the next tutorial where I'll talk about shading a two-sided glass. Okay, thanks.